Thomas Hartwell had grown accustomed to the silence that filled his modest cabin in the woods. 3 months had passed since Martha's death, and the quiet no longer felt suffocating. Instead, it had become his companion, as reliable as the morning mist that rolled through the pine trees surrounding his home. He spent his days chopping wood, tending to his small garden, and maintaining the fence that kept the deer from his vegetables. The routine helped him forget, if only for moments at a time, the sound of Martha's laughter that once echoed through these same rooms. On this particular morning, Thomas was splitting logs behind his cabin when he heard something unusual carried on the wind. At first, he thought it might be the call of a wounded animal, but as he paused and listened more carefully, he realized it was something far more troubling. The sound was human, weak and desperate, coming from the direction of the main road that ran about a mile through the forest. Thomas set down his axe and wiped his hands on his work pants. He rarely ventured toward the road anymore. Since Martha's passing, he had little interest in the affairs of the outside world. The occasional merchant or traveler who passed by meant nothing to him now. But this sound was different. Someone was in distress, and despite his desire to remain isolated, his conscience would not allow him to ignore it. He grabbed his rifle from inside the cabin, more out of habit than expectation of danger, and began making his way through the familiar forest paths toward the road. The morning air was crisp, and his breath formed small clouds as he walked quickly through the underbrush. The sounds grew clearer as he approached, and his heart began to race as he realized what he was hearing. There were moans of pain, the creak of damaged wood, and the heavy breathing of horses in distress. When Thomas finally reached the road, the scene before him made him freeze in shock. A merchant wagon lay overturned in the dirt, its contents scattered across the muddy path. Broken barrels and torn fabric were strewn everywhere, and the smell of spilled wine mixed with something far more sinister. 2 horses stood nearby, still hitched to the wagon, but clearly frightened and injured. One had a deep gash along its flank, while the other favored its left front leg. But it was not the destroyed wagon that held Thomas's attention. It was the bodies. 3 men lay motionless around the wreckage, their clothes torn and stained with blood. Bandits had clearly attacked this small caravan, taking whatever valuables they could find and leaving death in their wake. Thomas had heard stories of such attacks becoming more common on this stretch of road, but he had never witnessed the aftermath firsthand. As he stood taking in the terrible scene, he heard the sound again, the weak cry that had drawn him here in the first place. It was coming from beneath the overturned wagon. Someone was trapped underneath, still alive but clearly in desperate need of help. Thomas quickly set his rifle against a nearby tree and approached the wagon carefully. The wooden structure was heavy, but he could see a small gap where someone might have taken shelter during the attack. Kneeling down, he called out softly, not wanting to frighten whoever was trapped inside. "Hello? Can you hear me? I'm here to help." A woman's voice responded, so weak he could barely make out the words. "Please, help me. I cannot move my leg." Thomas examined the situation quickly. The wagon was resting at an angle against a large boulder, creating just enough space for someone to survive underneath, but not enough room for them to crawl out on their own. He would need to lift the wagon somehow, or at least shift it enough to create an opening. Looking around the wreckage, he found a long piece of timber that had broken off from the wagon's frame. It would work as a lever if he could find the right spot to place it. After several minutes of careful positioning, he managed to create enough leverage to lift one corner of the wagon slightly. "Can you move toward me now?" he called out. The response came slowly, accompanied by obvious pain. I think so." Gradually, a figure began to emerge from beneath the wagon. The first thing Thomas saw was a delicate hand, followed by a torn sleeve of what had once been an expensive dress. As the woman pulled herself free, he could see that she was young, perhaps in her mid-20s, with dark hair that had come loose from what must have been an elaborate arrangement. Her dress, though now dirty and ripped, was made of fine fabric that suggested wealth, but it was her face that struck Thomas most powerfully. Even covered with dirt and marked by obvious pain, she was remarkably beautiful. Her eyes were a deep green, and despite her current circumstances, they held an intelligence and strength that impressed him immediately. "Thank you," she whispered as she finally freed herself completely. I thought no one would find me." Thomas helped her move away from the wagon and lean against a nearby tree. He could see that her left leg was indeed injured, though he could not immediately tell how seriously. Her dress was torn in several places, and she had various cuts and bruises, but she appeared to be alert and coherent. "What happened here?" Thomas asked gently, though he suspected he already knew the answer. The woman closed her eyes for a moment, as if gathering strength to speak. "Bandits. They came from the trees just after dawn. There were 5 of them, maybe 6. They killed my guards before anyone could react." Her voice broke slightly. "They took everything of value and left us for dead." Thomas looked around at the scene again, his mind working quickly. The dead men were well-dressed and armed, clearly professional guards rather than simple travelers. This had not been a random attack on poor merchants, but a calculated assault on people of means. "We need to get you away from here," Thomas said. "Those bandits might return, and you need medical attention for that leg." The woman nodded weakly. "My name is Eleanor," she said quietly. "I owe you my life." "Thomas Hartwell," he replied, "and you don't owe me anything. Can you walk at all?" Eleanor tried to put weight on her injured leg and immediately winced in pain. "I don't think so. Not far, anyway." Thomas considered his options. His cabin was about a mile away through the forest. But carrying someone that distance would be difficult. However, staying here was not safe, and the nearest town was much farther than his home. "I'm going to help you to my cabin," he decided. "It's not far, and you can rest there while your leg heals. I have some medical supplies, and I can take care of the horses, too." Eleanor looked at him with surprise. In her world, strangers did not offer such help without expecting something in return. "You would do that for someone you don't know?" Thomas was quiet for a moment. "My wife always said that kindness given freely comes back to bless the giver. I haven't felt much blessed lately, but maybe she was right." He helped Eleanor to her feet and supported her weight as they began the slow journey back to his cabin. Behind them, the ravens were already gathering around the scene of the attack, and Thomas knew that by tomorrow there would be little evidence left of the tragedy that had occurred here. But walking beside him was living proof that sometimes, even in the darkest circumstances, hope could survive. The first week of Eleanor's recovery passed quietly in Thomas's cabin. He had fashioned a makeshift bed for her near the fireplace, using blankets and pillows that still carried the faint scent of lavender from Martha's time. Eleanor's leg was not broken, as they had initially feared, but badly bruised and twisted. With rest and care, Thomas believed it would heal completely within a month. During those early days, Eleanor said little about herself or her circumstances. When Thomas asked about her family or where she had been traveling, she would give vague answers or change the subject entirely. She claimed to be a merchant's daughter from a distant town, traveling with goods to sell in the larger cities. The story seemed plausible enough, though Thomas noticed inconsistencies in her knowledge of trade and commerce. What struck him most was how Eleanor carried herself, even while injured and dependent on his care. There was something in her posture, in the way she spoke, that suggested she was accustomed to being served rather than serving others. When he brought her meals, she would thank him with a graciousness that seemed almost formal, as if she were addressing a servant in a great house rather than the man who had saved her life. But as the days passed and Eleanor's strength returned, these formal barriers began to break down. She started asking Thomas about his life, his work, and eventually about Martha. He found himself talking more than he had in months, sharing memories and stories that he thought he had buried with his wife. "She sounds like she was a remarkable woman," Eleanor said one evening, as Thomas finished telling her about Martha's skill with herbs and healing. They were sitting by the fire, Eleanor's injured leg propped up on a cushion, while Thomas mended a tear in one of his shirts. "She was," Thomas replied simply. 22 years we were married, and not a single day passed that she didn't find some way to surprise me." Eleanor was quiet for a moment, staring into the flames. "You must have loved her very much." "I did. Still do, I suppose. Love like that doesn't just end when someone dies." There was something in Eleanor's expression that made Thomas look at her more carefully. "Have you ever been married?" Eleanor shook her head quickly, perhaps a bit too quickly. "No, I haven't had the opportunity. My father has been very protective, and with our business dealings, there hasn't been time for such things." It was another small lie, one of many that Eleanor had told since arriving at the cabin. In truth, she was Lady Eleanor Blackwood, daughter of Baron William Blackwood, and one of the wealthiest heiresses in the Northern Territories. She had been traveling in disguise to escape an arranged marriage to a cruel lord who was twice her age and known for his violent temper. The wagon attack had been meant to look like a random bandit assault, but Eleanor suspected it had been arranged by her intended husband to eliminate her so that he could claim her inheritance without the inconvenience of marriage. But sitting in this simple cabin with this kind, gentle man who had asked for nothing in return for saving her life, Eleanor found herself wanting to forget about her real identity entirely. For the first time in her 24 years, she was being valued for herself rather than her title or her fortune. Thomas saw her as Eleanor the merchant's daughter, not Lady Eleanor, with her vast estates and political connections. As her leg healed and she became more mobile, Eleanor began helping with the household tasks. At first, her attempts at cooking and cleaning were laughably inept. She had never prepared a meal in her life, and her first attempt at making bread resulted in something that resembled a brick more than food. But Thomas was patient with her, teaching her basic skills without making her feel foolish for not knowing them. "You really haven't done much domestic work, have you?" Thomas observed one morning as Eleanor struggled to milk the cow he kept in a small shed behind the cabin. Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks. "My father, he believed education was more important for daughters than housework. I spent more time with tutors than in the kitchen." It was partially true. Eleanor had indeed received an excellent education, with tutors in languages, literature, mathematics, and even some subjects typically reserved for men, like economics and politics. But the real reason she had never learned domestic skills was that there had always been servants to handle such things. "Well," Thomas said with a smile, "Martha always said it was never too late to learn something useful." Over the following weeks, a comfortable routine developed between them. Thomas would tend to his outdoor work while Eleanor managed increasingly complex household tasks. She discovered that she actually enjoyed the physical nature of domestic work, the satisfaction of creating something useful with her own hands. When she successfully baked her first edible loaf of bread, her pride was so evident that Thomas found himself laughing for the first time since Martha's death. The sound of his laughter seemed to surprise them both. Eleanor looked up from her bread with such delight on her face that Thomas felt something stir in his chest that he thought had died with his wife. He turned away quickly, uncomfortable with the feeling. But such moments became more common as Eleanor's presence brought life back to the cabin. She had a quick wit and a sharp intelligence that challenged Thomas in ways he hadn't experienced in years. Their evening conversations ranged from practical matters to philosophy, from local politics to distant lands that Eleanor seemed to know surprising amounts about for a simple merchant's daughter. One evening, as they sat by the fire after a particularly engaging discussion about trade policies, Thomas found himself really looking at Eleanor for the first time in weeks. Her leg had healed almost completely, and she moved with a natural grace that he found captivating. Her dark hair, now clean and properly arranged, caught the firelight in a way that made his breath catch slightly. "You could leave now," he said quietly, "if you wanted to. Your leg is strong enough for travel." Eleanor's hands stilled on the sewing she had been working on. "Do you want me to leave?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with meanings that neither was quite ready to acknowledge. Thomas realized that somewhere during these weeks of shared meals and conversations, of watching Eleanor transform from a helpless victim into a vibrant, capable woman, he had begun to care for her in a way that both thrilled and terrified him. "No," he said finally. "I don't want you to leave." Eleanor set down her sewing and looked directly at him. "Then I won't." "Not yet." But even as she spoke the words, Eleanor knew that her time in this peaceful sanctuary was limited. Sooner or later, her father would send people looking for her. Her absence would not go unnoticed indefinitely, and when they found her, she would have to return to her real life. The thought of leaving Thomas, of giving up this simple happiness for the complications and dangers of her true position, filled her with a sadness she had never experienced before. That night, as Eleanor lay in her bed near the dying fire, she made a decision that would have shocked everyone who knew Lady Eleanor Blackwood. She decided that for as long as possible, she would remain simply Eleanor, the merchant's daughter who had found unexpected love in the home of a grieving widower. The sound of horses approaching at dawn shattered the peaceful quiet that Thomas and Eleanor had grown to treasure. Thomas was outside splitting kindling when he heard the thundering hooves, and something in the urgency of their approach made him drop his axe and reach for the rifle he kept propped against the cabin wall. Eleanor heard the sounds from inside and felt her heart sink with a dread she had been expecting for weeks. She moved quickly to the window and peered through the curtain, her worst fears confirmed when she saw the approaching riders. 6 men on horseback, wearing the distinctive blue and silver livery of her father's house, were riding hard toward the cabin with the determination of people who had finally found what they were looking for. "Thomas," Eleanor called, her voice tight with tension, "you need to come inside, now." But it was too late. The riders had already spotted Thomas standing outside the cabin with his rifle, and their leader was calling out commands that made Eleanor's blood run cold. "You there! Step away from that weapon. We're here on official business of Baron Blackwood." Eleanor watched through the window as Thomas slowly set down his rifle, confusion clear on his face. He had no idea who Baron Blackwood was, or why men bearing the Baron's colors would have any business with a simple woodsman. The lead rider dismounted and approached Thomas with the confident bearing of a man accustomed to being obeyed. He was tall and well-armed, with the kind of professional demeanor that marked him as the captain of a noble house's guard. "I am Captain Morrison, in service to Baron William Blackwood," the man announced formally. "We have reason to believe you may be harboring a missing person of considerable importance. A young woman, dark hair, traveling under suspicious circumstances." Thomas's mind raced as he tried to understand what was happening. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said carefully. "I live alone here." Captain Morrison smiled, but it was not a pleasant expression. "Sir, we have tracked evidence of the wagon attack 3 weeks ago to this area. We know that Lady Eleanor Blackwood was traveling on that road when bandits struck. We also know that someone helped the survivors of that attack. Now I'm going to ask you once more, and I suggest you answer truthfully. Where is Lady Eleanor Blackwood?" The words hit Thomas like a physical blow. Lady Eleanor Blackwood. Not Eleanor the merchant's daughter, but Lady Eleanor, daughter of one of the most powerful nobles in the region. The woman he had come to love, the woman who had brought joy back into his life after Martha's death, was a baroness who had been lying to him for weeks. Inside the cabin, Eleanor knew that the moment of truth had arrived. She could hide no longer, could not continue the deception that had allowed her to experience the only genuine happiness she had ever known. With a heavy heart, she smoothed her simple dress and walked to the door. "Captain Morrison," she called out as she stepped outside, "you may stop threatening this good man. I am here." The transformation in the soldiers' behavior was immediate and dramatic. They dismounted quickly and arranged themselves in formation, their captain stepping forward with obvious relief on his face. "Lady Eleanor, thank the heavens you are safe. Your father has been beside himself with worry. Half the kingdom is searching for you." Thomas stood frozen, staring at Eleanor as if seeing her for the first time. The woman who had struggled to milk his cow, who had burned her first attempts at cooking, who had shared his bed by the fire and his conversations by candlelight, was revealed as a lady of such high standing that these hardened soldiers treated her with obvious reverence. "Hello, Thomas," Eleanor said quietly, her eyes meeting his across the small distance that suddenly felt like an enormous chasm. "I suppose I owe you an explanation." Before Thomas could respond, Captain Morrison stepped between them. "My lady, we must leave immediately. There are those who would do you harm, and remaining here puts both you and this man in danger." "What danger?" Thomas found his voice at last. "What is all this about?" Eleanor looked at the captain, who nodded reluctantly. If they expected Thomas to understand why she had to leave, he deserved to know the truth. 3 months ago, Eleanor began, my father arranged a marriage for me to Lord Aldrich of Ravenshire. Lord Aldrich is a cruel man who has buried 2 wives already under suspicious circumstances. The marriage would combine our lands and give him control of my inheritance. I refused." She paused, gathering strength to continue. "When I persisted in my refusal, Lord Aldrich began making threats. I believe the attack on my wagon was arranged by him, meant to eliminate me so that he could claim my inheritance without the inconvenience of marriage. I was traveling in disguise, trying to reach my uncle's lands where I might find protection." Thomas felt the ground shifting beneath him as he began to understand the magnitude of what Eleanor had been hiding. "And instead, you ended up here, lying to me about who you were." The pain in his voice made Eleanor step toward him, but Captain Morrison moved to block her path. "My lady, Lord Aldrich's men may not be far behind. We must leave at once." "I never meant to lie to you," Eleanor said desperately, trying to speak around the captain. "I told you my name was Eleanor because it is my name. Everything else, I wanted to forget about my title, about my responsibilities. For the first time in my life, I was just Eleanor, not Lady Eleanor. Do you understand?" Thomas looked at her for a long moment, and she could see him struggling with emotions too complex for simple words. "I understand that the woman I fell in love with was a fiction," he said finally. The words struck Eleanor like a physical blow. "No, Thomas. The woman you fell in love with is standing right here. The title doesn't change who I am inside." "Doesn't it?" Thomas asked. "You're a baroness. Your father probably owns more land than I've ever seen in my life. What could someone like you possibly want with a simple woodsman who has nothing to offer but a small cabin and an honest day's work?" Captain Morrison, growing increasingly anxious about their exposed position, decided to end the conversation. "My lady, I'm sorry, but we cannot wait any longer." Eleanor made a decision that surprised everyone present, including herself. "Captain, I need you to take the men and return to my father. Tell him that I am safe and that I will send word of my intentions within a fortnight." "My lady, I cannot leave you here unprotected." "You can and you will," Eleanor said, her voice carrying the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "I am giving you a direct order. Return to my father and tell him what I have said." The captain struggled visibly with conflicting duties. "My lady, your father will have my head if I return without you." Then tell him that his daughter has finally found something worth fighting for, and that he will have to trust her judgment." After several more minutes of argument, Eleanor's determination won out. The soldiers departed reluctantly, leaving Eleanor and Thomas alone to face the chasm that her revealed identity had created between them. "Why did you send them away?" Thomas asked. Eleanor walked closer to him, close enough to see the hurt and confusion in his eyes. "Because I love you, Thomas Hartwell, not because you're useful to me, or because you can advance my position, or because someone arranged it for political reasons. I love you because you're kind and good and honest, because you saved my life and asked nothing in return, because you taught me what it means to work with my hands and find joy in simple things." Thomas looked down at her, seeing past the title and the complications to the woman who had brought his cabin to life again. "Your father will never accept me. A baron's daughter doesn't marry a widowed woodsman." Eleanor smiled, and for the first time since the soldiers had arrived, it was her genuine smile. "My father has learned that forcing me to marry against my will doesn't work very well, and I have enough inheritance in my own right to live independently if necessary." "You would give up your title, your wealth, your position?" "I would give up anything to build a life with you," Eleanor said simply. "But I don't think I'll have to. My father is a practical man, and he'll realize that a daughter who is happy and safe is worth more than one who is married for political advantage, but dead from her husband's cruelty." Thomas reached out and took her hands in his, work-roughened fingers intertwining with softer ones that nevertheless bore the calluses she had earned over the past weeks of honest labor. "Are you certain?" he asked. "Your world and mine are so different." Eleanor looked around at the simple cabin, the small garden, the forest that had become her sanctuary. "This is my world now, Thomas, if you'll have me." 2 months later, when Baron Blackwood arrived for an unexpected visit, he found his daughter contentedly hanging laundry behind a modest cabin, while a tall, serious man worked in a nearby garden. The Baron had come prepared to drag Eleanor home by force if necessary, but what he saw in her face when she looked at Thomas made him reconsider everything he thought he knew about his daughter's happiness. The wedding was small, but joyful, attended by both Eleanor's family and the few neighbors Thomas had in the surrounding area. Eleanor kept her title but took Thomas's name, and the Baron surprised everyone by gifting them a substantial tract of land that bordered Thomas's small property. On their wedding night, as they sat by the fire in the cabin where their love had grown, Eleanor and Thomas spoke of the future they would build together. It would be a life that bridged two worlds, combining Eleanor's education and resources with Thomas's wisdom and practical skills. "Do you ever regret it?" Thomas asked, watching his new wife's face in the firelight. "Giving up the life you were born to?" Eleanor smiled and moved closer to him, feeling the solid strength of the man who had saved her life in more ways than one. "I didn't give up anything, Thomas. I found everything I didn't even know I was looking for."